So welcome. Fine.
Yeah.
Presentation. Okay. Do you want me to make the what I've done? What I've done with the when we did the last one, I did here. What I've done? I put you here. So just you there. Do you see what I mean? Because you don't need to be looking at the screen. This screen here. Because they've got it there.
Just so you know we're live.
Are we live?
Yeah,
You see all that?
I'm let me know. Cool. Well, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the London Archives. My name is Tom. I'm an Engagement Learning Officer here at the Archive. This is my colleague Simon, who's also an Engagement Learning Officer. I think technically I'm demoting him to Senior Engagement Learning Officer here at the Archives, and he has the extra responsibility of managing the chat today. So, as you can probably guess, this is a hybrid event this afternoon. So, as well as the event in person here, we are broadcasting this on our YouTube channel as well, and it will remain up after the event should you want to kind of go back and reference it for any reason. I'd like to start with a bit of a thank you and a happy Christmas. This will be the last event that I'll be doing this year. There are a few other events at the Archive this year, so it's a nice note to end on, to see some familiar faces in the audience and some new faces as well. It's been a big year for the Archives. We've changed from London Metropolitan Archives to the London Archives, so we're all looking forward to a bit of a rest over the Christmas period, and I hope you all have a chance to do that as well, and hope to see some of you in the new year as well. And by sort of suitably festive coincidence, we're having a Christmas jumper day at work today, hence our attire, and I thought it only fitting to wear my most Dickensian of all Christmas jumpers, a little homage to what I think is indisputably not only the best Christmas film, but the most superior literary adaptation of Dickens' work, which is of course The Muppets Christmas Carol. Yeah. So a happy Christmas and Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year to you all, if I don't see you any before then. So our talk this afternoon ties into our exhibition, Lost Victorian City, a London Disappeared, and in many ways this is the inspiration for that exhibition. So this afternoon we'll spend the next sort of 45 minutes or so, plus some time for questions, talking about a collection of around 120 images from an organisation called the Society for the Protection of the Relics of Old London. And as I say, this ties into the theme of the exhibition, which is a London that was once familiar that has faded from view. The exhibition opened in spring summer this year, and it will be running until February next year, so early February next year. So there's still plenty of time to see it, but I know I often find myself getting a bit caught out when exhibitions end. So just a little advance notice about that, and there will be a few more exhibition themed events early next year, and in general, our new events brochure is now out, all of which you'll find on Eventbrite as well. There's a couple of copies at the back of the room today, and also there'll be some on the various desks on the way out as well. And it would be remiss of me not to highlight a couple of them before we start. The most important, I think, being on the 17th of January, we'll actually be getting the original documents out that we'll be looking at on the screen today. We'll be looking at the original photographs for that, so that might be of interest to you as well. And then talks wise next year, and I've forgotten the date, there's another document viewing that might be of interest to you on the 14th of February. There's a more general look at our photographs collections, and also in February of next year we'll be looking more closely into the work of Henry Dixon, who is one of the photographers associated with that today. There'll be some overlap to what we look at today, but there'll be some exploration of his earlier work as well. So let's get started with the collection at hand. So the closing years, or the second half, or the latter third of the 19th century had seen London change immensely. If we compare the London at the end of the 19th century to that at the beginning, or even if we compare the London at the start of Queen Victoria's long reign to the end, we would see a massively transformed London. It was transformed in both its size and its density. The population of London grows hugely throughout this period, as more and more people are kind of concentrating and are sort of attracted to London from both around the domestically, from around Great Britain, but from around the world as well. The economy of London, both as the capital city of Great Britain, but also of the capital of a kind of a global trading empire, means that there is wealth and there is opportunity being concentrated in London. So it's a time of huge growth. It's also a time of huge technological change, huge change in transport, in infrastructure, all those sorts of things. And this causes many problems in as London grows. Its growth might be described as organic if we're feeling charitable, unplanned, a little bit more detached, even sort of chaotic or ramshackle if we're feeling a little bit more tabloid in our verbiage. And what this meant by the end of the by the sort of the closing years, the last quarter of the 19th century, is there was a sense that London needed to be transformed, it needed to be improved, it needed to be regularised, order needed to be brought to this sort of this sprawling metropolis. And what this meant in practice was that there would be demolition of old buildings. This was often to make way for new forms of transport, for example, or new forms of building. Offices and other purpose-built buildings. Also railways and roads were built to allow the increasingly congested London traffic to flow better, or certainly that was the attempt. As with many traffic schemes, sometimes it can be a victim of its own success. So there was railway building, there was road building, so there was other infrastructure being built, and often this infrastructure went hand in hand with what was seen as an opportunity by the planners and powers that be to kind of improve what they might have called the social fabric of London. It was a chance to knock down old housing stock. It was a chance to demolish the sort of the slums and the rookeries of the Victorian imagination. And so what this meant was that many sites and sort of buildings that were familiar to Londoners, often for centuries, were starting to disappear. They were starting to be demolished to make way for these new buildings and the like. And this for some was hailed as progress and improvement, but for others there was a nostalgia, a lament, a sadness for what was passing. And one person that would sort of fit in that latter camp was the antiquarian Alfred Marks. And in 1875 he wrote a letter to the Times, lamenting the forthcoming demolition of the Oxford Arms, which was a galleried coaching inn in Warwick Lane on the edges of the city of London. For him, this was a charming building that was soon to be lost to history. And what he proposed was that he would gather a group of subscribers, and in the language of the day he described them as gentlemen subscribers. They would gather together a group of gentlemen subscribers, and they would photograph as he put them, the relics of old London, and this would provide a record for posterity. And his initial letter in the Times met with some appreciation, and we think he was able to gather about 100 or so subscribers, and together that gave him the resources to undertake a project which would last for 11 years and would produce 120 images of a London, some of which has disappeared, some of which hasn't, but certainly if the subjects of some of the photographs remain, their context has of course radically changed. And the name, the Society for the Protection of the Relics of Old London, is one of those quite fun pieces of propaganda. Might be a bit strong. Certainly PR. There probably never really was a society. It probably was Alfred Marks, the photographers he worked with, John Ball and Henry Dixon. And the people that bought them. So in that sense, it wasn't a society. It's a slightly misleading name, but it certainly was a passion project, and it certainly has something that has produced a really treasured record of London of this time. And we can see an example of what they produced on the screen here. And my intention for the time we have together this afternoon is not to take you through 120 separate images. That might be a bit much, as charming and interesting as they are. That could be a bit laborious for all concerned. What I'll do is I'll take you through a selection of the images based partly on giving a representative sample of what they include, some crowd pleasers, and frankly things that I like. That seemed the fairest way of doing it. But I will say up front that if there are ones you particularly wanted to see, if there are omissions, firstly, if you're able to, come along in January to see them in person. But if for whatever reason that won't work for you, they are all available online on our online image database, the London Picture Archive. You can see them all there. And even these days, a little plug in time for Christmas, you're able to buy them as well. You can order a print of them as well, should that be something that appeals to you. So I've talked about 120 different images, and I've talked about subscribers. So before we go into the details of the image themselves, it might be nice for me to tell you a little bit about how they worked. So initially, with the letter of in the Times appears in 1875. Then in 1876, a series of photographs are taken of the Oxford Arms in Warwick Lane, and 6 prints are produced, and then a series of prints are produced every year for the next 11 get the numbers right, yeah, I think it's 11 years. Initially it's 6 a year, growing to 12 a year as the project gathers some steam. The works themselves are described as sort of collaborative compositions between Alfred Marks, who we've heard of as the instigator of this project, but also a father and son team, the Bulls, who take the images, and then Henry Dixon, who initially starts as the person that produces the prints of the images, but later on becomes the photographer as well. He both photographs and prints the images. In the first couple of years of the publication of the series, it was just the prints themselves, and you see an example of them on the screen here that were produced. But about two years into the project, the prints were accompanied by the photographic prints were accompanied by some text as well, which gives a bit of background to the buildings that are being photographed, and a bit of a background to sort of the selection process as well. And rather pleasingly, from our perspective, they backdated them as well. So although they start a few years in, they do go back and produce them for the whole series. So that gives a nice completeness to them. We don't know exactly how many sets of these images were produced. We suspect about 100, based on the idea that there were about 100 subscribers, but that is an educated guess, but it seems a fairly reasonable one. In archival terms, these images are fairly common, in that there's a set here at the London Archive, there's a set at Bishopsgate, there's a set at the British Library, the Yale Centre for British Art, and other places. English Heritage, Historic England, I always get the two muddled up. One of those two, however many years later, I should know the difference by now between the two. They have a set as well. So they are fairly common. But what is less common actually is the accompanying text. So it's quite nice that we have a set of those here at the London Archives. So we've had a bit of a background into the genesis of the project, and now we can start to look at some of the first images. So for the first year, I thought it'd be nice to see all 6 images, because it gives a sense of the project, and they're particularly nice selection images. And then from then on, we'll be a little bit more selective about which images we see. So this is the Oxford Arms coaching in, and it's worth spending a little bit of time on these images, because they give a sense of the spirit of the project. So this is described as a galleried coaching in. So the galleries refer to the arrangement there in the image on the right hand side. As you are looking at it, you can see that this inn is arranged around a courtyard, and then around the top there are galleries, hence galleried in, and it's a coaching inn, which, as the name suggests, it serves long distance travel, the coaching trade. Before the advent of the railways, this was how people travelled long distances. So this would be the form of intercity travel for both people and for goods as well. So coaching was associated with the transport of both of them. And these coaching inns were places where you could get both hospitality for yourself, food, drink, somewhere to stay, but also they provided the necessary services for the horses as well, and the coaching. So that was the purpose of the coaching inns. And I'm sure an erudite crowd such as yourself don't need to tell you, however, but by the time that the photographs are being taken, they are obsolete, and they are obsolete because of the saturation of the railways. So we see what's often described as a railway mania starting from the 1830s, with cities being increasingly connected up with railway lines, revolutionising transport in this country. So the coaching trade becomes secondary, is eclipsed by the railways, and the coaching inns themselves are eclipsed by the railway hotels. Think about the Grand St Pancras Hotel, but there are others, of course. That same function is fulfilled by a different set of businesses. And so by the 1870s, the galleried inns are coming to a close, and you can see certainly on the image on the left-hand side, this one is starting to look a little bit forlorn. We can see that sort of it's a bit dilapidated. I think it's the sort of its faded grandeur for me is both summed up by, if you look on the right-hand side of the image, on the right-hand side of the right-hand image, if you see the first-hand gallery, you can see there's an old lamp there at this sort of slightly wonky capsizing angle. For me, that sort of sums it all up. And the point of this faded grandeur is, I think we might see it slightly better in this next image, is that with the decline of the gallery coaching in, it's not just a form of transport, a form of hospitality that is perhaps passing from history, but rather there's a whole kind of way of life associated with these inns, and actually wrapped up in some of the kind of sort of most important parts and the most celebrated parts of our culture, and indeed some of the less celebrated as well. Geographically, you tend to find these coaching. You would find these coaching inns on the outskirts of the city, and by that I mean the city of London, the square mile, the historic city. It tended to be that the city of London was stricter about things we might call as vices. I don't mean that quite as judgmentally as it sounds, but perhaps it's a useful shorthand. So it was easier to do things that were fun or that you weren't supposed to outside the city. And hence that's why places would pop up on the outskirts. Southwark was particularly famous in that regard, and you can't think of Southwark and Vice without thinking of theatre, of course, and in particular you think of the theatres of Shakespeare's time. If you picture the Globe Theatre, or even if you've been to its reincarnation, picture the Globe Theatre and then look at the gallery of coaching in, and you might see some similarities. Indeed, you can describe the Globe Theatre as a purpose-built coaching in, because the tradition of the theatrical tradition that Shakespeare's plays grew out of was that of travelling performers. They'd travel with a wagon. The wagon would become the stage. You'd park your wagon in the centre of a gallery coaching in, and that would become your stage. And this really is just to give one example of how it's not just a building that was going. There's a whole kind of romantic tradition associated with it as well, or certainly that's, I'm sure, how Alfred Marx would see it. And he was prescient, of course, that these were disappearing. There is only now one gallery coaching in that remains, and that's the George in Southwark, if you ever fancy getting a sense of what this could look like in person. And so we have a sense of the purpose, but it's also worth reflecting on these images there, because not only are they a record of what was there, we can also celebrate them as works of photography as well. And it's interesting. It is interesting that photography was chosen as the medium to record these buildings. I think today we might think of it as fairly self-evident that if you wanted to have an accurate, a detailed, a record for posterity, the photography is probably the way to go. We are spoilt, I think, with our easy access to photography, the simplicity of the process, from our sort of camera phones to more specialist equipment. But it's worth remembering that as an art form, as a way of recording visual scenes, photography is really only about 40 years old at this point. It's a very immature technology, but it's one that Alfred Marx, the Bulls, Henry Dix as well, think has great promise for recording, and they see it as almost like one tool in the toolbox, or one brush in the paint box, we might say, of recording London. But they were keen to stress that the verisimilitude, its ability to capture lifelike scenes. And I think, again, being a little bit romantic, for me, there's something quite nice that that this is a photographic record. Obviously, photography is the process of photography is to pass light onto some kind of medium that records it and then reproduce that. So it's quite nice to think that the light that was then there has touched that same piece of carbon that we have now, as a way to kind of carry that forward through to posterity. And the final thing, I suppose, it'd be worth saying at this stage about the kind of the medium of photography that was chosen is that, again, photography itself is a relatively new phenomena, and it's undergoing very quick changes, both in terms of how the image is initially captured, and I think more importantly for our purposes today, how that image is then reproduced. So these are described as carbon prints, or carbon pigment prints, and these give a very stable image, and they give an image that can be fairly, by the standards of the day, could be fairly easily replicated, hence the number of copies. And they also were a medium that was designed to last, say, a long time, so they had that kind of archival format in mind when they were choosing their medium. And then the other thing I should probably say about photography is take a moment on these in particular, all of them, just to appreciate actually how nicely kind of composed and framed they are. Partly actually inspired by a previous talk I did on this collection. I've been trying to understand and get a little bit more kind of a vocabulary around appreciating photography, and the things they talk about are the rule of thirds and kind of lines across, draw the eye into an image. You can see that in abundance on the right hand image. Another thing that they talk about as a nice way to compose photographs is to find interesting frames and viewpoints, that frames within the photograph, and obviously that's very clear on the image on the left hand side as well. So very expertly captured, composed and reproduced images. And this is the last of the first. This is the last of the first of the 6 images. A few more of the Oxford Arms in Warwick Lane. And for this one, I'm actually more interested in the foreground rather than, in the background rather than the foreground of this image. Have a look on the image on the right hand side. We can see St Paul's Cathedral there. And what I think is nice about these images is obviously they record buildings that have since disappeared or been demolished, but at the same time they also give us the sense of the context, what the street scenes were like around them. And what's nice about this one is it gives us a sense of what the city might have looked like, the scale of the city when Christopher Wren was rebuilding St Paul's Cathedral, was rebuilding the city churches following the Great Fire of London of 1666. It gives a sense of a different style, what's sometimes called a picaresque style, or sort of a more humanist style. So rather than as it is today, St Paul's being actually one of the smaller things on the skyline, certainly in the modern city, it was one of the biggest things on the skyline. It dominated rather than perhaps being sort of dwarfed, as you might say, that it is today. And the architecture of Christopher Wren has kind of, like any sort of great architect, has kind of gone up and down in sort of popular esteem over the centuries in Wren's case. But by the late Victorian period and certainly the early Edwardian period, Christopher Wren was very popular. He was very much in vogue, and his designs, his sort of style was copied. The Old Bailey, which a modern extension of the Old Bailey now sits on this very site here. The dome of the Old Bailey was a deliberate reference to Christopher Wren's work in what was described as the Renaissance, with a W there, by some hilarious Edwardian punster. So this is, I think, a nice. I spent quite a lot of time on the first year, as seemed appropriate. But from here on in, we won't perhaps spend quite so much time on any one image and on any one year. So as we heard, the Society of Photographic Relics produced initially 6 and then later 12 prints per year. One can assume, of course, that they took more photographs than that. And number 7 and 8 in this series are old houses in Wych Street, and that's Wych as in Aldwych, so near just the other side of Waterloo Bridge, and that's St Bride's Church in the background there, the famous wedding cake church, to give you a sense of where you are. As we heard, 120 images were taken in total, and about 60 of about 60 of the subjects survive. So about 50% of things survive, and we see a variety of subjects, quite a lot of houses, and it tends to be houses are things that don't survive, and it tends to be churches, halls, those sorts of things tend to survive. Houses a lot less so. So it's nice to have this record of what would have been the housing stock. And this is where we can slightly question our nostalgia. I think it's always a shame when old buildings go, but we can ask what it would have been like to live in these buildings, how comfortable they would have been, how fit for purpose they would have been. Whether some sort of Ebenezer Scrooge type character would have been charging a fortune for his dark and drafty houses. And in this next slide, as I say, from the year after, we get a sense of the variety of subjects that are being taken. And this is on the left. This is the churchyard of St Bartholomew the Great, and on the right-hand side, it's the same churchyard, but from a different, the north side of the church and the Paul's Church, from a very different perspective. And one of the things that I alluded to earlier, and that that Alfred Marx made explicit, was that photography was but one of many mediums to record the London that was disappearing from him. And he talks in his accompanying notes at some length about this church in particular, how he wanted to use photography to record the context of it, as we might put it today. He wanted to use photography to get a sense of the exterior, how it fits in with its surroundings. But he thought that the other methods, watercolour, etchings, or some that he named, might be more appropriate for photographing the interior of the church. So I thought that was a nice thing to highlight. And indeed, Henry Dixon, who we'll talk about a little bit more in a moment's time, who initially made the prints and then later took the images and made the prints, was an etcher as well. So he was a photographer and he was an etcher. You could say he was an image maker, and I'm sure you can see how that would be a sort of a natural progression if you have some kind of image making ability, the technique for that and facilities, how photography might be something you would invest in both the equipment and the skill to sort of upskill yourself, we might say today, to add that to your portfolio. So it's nice to think about that purpose of context as well. And also in this image on the right hand side, we get a good sense of actually how modern some of these images are. And this particular image is often sort of celebrated as it's not actually an expression I'm particularly fond of, but I can't think of a better one, so I use it anyway. It's described as ahead of its time in terms of its composition, in terms of what it's doing. Chitra Ramalangiam, who was assistant curator of photography at the Yale Centre for British Art, who brought together an exhibition of these photographs in 2016, really stresses the modernism of this image. She would be one of those critics that would describe it as ahead of its time. Again, I'm sort of learning the language of photography a little bit on the job, which I'm finding quite enjoyable. So expect to be subjected to more photographic talks in the future, I'm afraid to say. But when they're talking about the modernism of this image, what they are referring to is the is almost the sort of the lack of distinct subjects, the use of the intersecting lines and the planes and shadows as they come together. So it's not immediately obvious what you're seeing, and there's the sense of it's the angles and the lines that are interesting to you. This is also worth noting as well, that really in this set of images we don't see a lot of people. There are some very vivid collections of Victorian street photography in our collection. Indeed, if you want to see some if you're here in person, on your way out, have a look on the right-hand side of the exhibition, and you can see some images from Dorothy Smith's Street Life London. If you're at home, type in Street Life London to the Picture Archive and you'll see them as well. So there is a very strong tradition of Victorian street photography that's beginning around this time. There's a tradition before that of things like Cries of London, where other visual mediums are used to record life on London streets. But that's not what we're seeing here. We do see some photographs, we do see some people in these photographs, and you might be able to spot one here. There is what looks to me like a boy there, in sort of the middle of the images in this alleyway. There is a boy there, but we suspect that the images are either possibly passers-by, but more likely they're sometimes given, they're included just really to give a sense of scale to the images rather than as the subjects themselves. This is described as an unorthodox image by the critics, certainly in the context of its time, and it's probably worth reflecting then how this image would have been taken. So it's likely that and I think it was Dixon at this point taking the photographs. It's likely what Dixon would have had to do is actually climb on that wall there that we can see leading us into the photograph. We'll have to sort of climb on that and balance on that, and that's likely the vantage point of where he took his photograph. A fairly intrepid move with today's lightweight cameras, but an even bolder move with a far bulkier Victorian photographic equipment, and that does remind us that there was a process involved. There's a photographer involved in the collection of these images, and we do hear some interesting stories about how these images were taken. Graham Bush in Images of Old London tells us that when photographing a crowded street, Dixon used to work from a covered wagon. He'd have his camera in the back of the wagon, and then he'd find where he wanted the subject of his photograph, and then he'd have an assistant take off one of the wheels of the carriage in a sort of a Victorian equivalent of pretending to have broken down. I'm not sure how you describe a broken down cart, so I'll forgive my anachronism, but had one of the wheels of his cart taken off, and there'd be I like to imagine an elaborate pantomime of trying to get this wheel fixed, but I might be letting my imagination run wild with me there. But they would sort of have this, make this scene of taking the image. All the while, Henry Dixon is literally working undercover, taking his image. And without meaning to, I have featured rather a lot of Christopher Wren in this work. On the left, we can see the Temple Bar, the sort of traditional boundary between the cities of London and Westminster, and on the right we can see some decorative ironwork in Leadenhall Street. And the purpose of including both of these, I say partly, I did give fair warning. Some of the things were picked because I rather like them, and I have a bit of a love-hate relationship with the Temple with the Temple Bar, if I'm perfectly honest. So one of my sort of first forays into the work of what's sometimes called public history was working as a tour guide on the London buses, the double-decker buses that go round and round and round, and we'd often get stuck in traffic on Fleet Street. So you'll now know by the Royal Courts of Justice. There's the monument to Temple Bar, one of the dragons of the city crest lives there. But that was a real kind of traffic bottleneck, and I'd have to keep your patter going if you're doing a tour, even if you're in a traffic jam. So I would have to break out quite a lot of, Fleet Street related facts, Royal Court Just related facts, and I had to spend more time than I probably would have chosen to talking about the Temple Bar in particular. So I would. And I would also have particular sympathy for my Victorian forebears, because this was removed because it was an even worse traffic black spot. So it was removed. It was removed as part of a bigger redevelopment of the Royal Courts of Justice. For many years, it went into warehouse. It lived in Cheshunt in Hertfordshire, but I think it's about 10 years ago now. It's been rebuilt in Paternoster Square near St Paul's. So another perhaps nice sense of things being lost in a different way. So perhaps its original context has been lost, but it has been moved. And the other reason, aside from my sort of my vested interest in the location, is it also gives us a sense of why, another idea of why things were moving. So modern Fleet Street by the Royal Courts of Justice is a fairly upmarket and sort of safe place to be, fairly respectable. No one would ask you any questions about going there. Not so in the late Victorian period. We're all adults here. I hope you don't mind me being a little bit saying this before the watershed. In the 19th century, if you wanted to buy some pornography, you go to the back streets around the back of Fleet Street. That was where that's different side of Victorian photography was coming into bloom, shall we say? And there was other associations with the area. It was seen as a slum. It was seen as very dangerous. Den of vice, we might say, a bit anachronistically. So there was an opportunity taken by the sort of city planners and by central and local government, sort of to kill two birds with one stone. So the Royal Courts of Justice were built there as a symbol of order and a way of displacing this sort of insalubrious side of London as well. And we'll pick up a little bit of pace as we go through, just to give a sense of the different subjects. This is Barnard's Inn, the courtyard of Barnard's Inn on the left, and houses in Aldergate Street as well. Again, to remind you, about 60 of the 120 subjects survive, and it tended to be the grander buildings rather than the houses survive. So the images on the left survive, and not on the right. And this one I chose, again, because I think they're really beautiful images, all those nice aspects of composition that we can see on number 30. Excuse me, this is the Charter House, which is very local to us here. Nice image, nice composition, but I also picked it because of the local history link. So Charterhouse is a corruption of Carthusian, which was the monastic order that initially founded this site. As part of the dissolution of the monasteries and the various machinations that came with that, the property was taken into private ownership, and now today it's an almshouse. So it's a charitable residence, and it's about a 10-minute walk from, or 15-minute walk from here. So nice to bring in the local history collection, but also I think in that image on the right, in particular of the cloisters, I think it's a very beautiful image. You get a real sense of history there. I can imagine both the monks, pacing up and down in spiritual contemplation, and I can imagine the various sort of Tudor aristocrats and the like who were sort of put there under house arrest, pacing, with far more worldly concerns in their minds as well. But it also gives us a sense of another way in which these images have been appreciated by critics, and that's the term chiaroscuro, which some of you may well have heard. But chiaroscuro implies to the kind of the pleasing interplay of dark and light, the pleasing interplay of light and shadow, and I think that's sort of very, very clear in number 40, that image of the cloisters there, the way that sort of the shadow kind of comes in at this lovely angle through the image. This is another coaching inn for us, the King's Head Yard, and I mentioned when we were talking about when we were talking about the Warwick Arms, that it was not just for people that will provide hospitality at these sites. It was often the animals as well. So we can see that horse there in the image on the right hand side. And I wanted to draw in as well this theme of lost Victorian London to link back to the exhibition. Excuse me. One of the sort of important themes of a Victorian London was horses. Today there are other used ceremonial occasions. If we think changing of the guard, or for crowd control, they're really the main reasons we'll see horses in London today. But obviously in the Victorian period, horses and animals more generally were a far more common sight. Here we have Ashburnham House, which is part of today's Westminster School, and I chose to include these for two reasons. On the right, I know it's perhaps a bit weird. It might mean I've just spent far too long in an archive. I'm just a sucker for a nicely framed photograph of an antique staircase. So we all have our things. I'm afraid that is now one of mine. And it's also, I should say, a rare interior photograph in this collection, which primarily deals with the outsides of buildings. And it only seemed fitting to include the exterior as well. So that's Ashburnham House, as I said, part of Westminster part of Westminster School today. But it's also another reminder of that thing I alluded to earlier, of a city on a different context. I just really like this view of that's Westminster Abbey appearing in the background. That's the medieval facade of Westminster Abbey, the rose window. I just think that's just, as I say, a very nice image. So I wanted to include that as well, just to give us a slightly different sense of scale. And we're coming to the last few images here. Picking up on that point of scale, number 79, that's the golden axe in St Mary Axe, and that is today the approximate location of the Gherkin, that famous building, which I both really rather like as a work in and of itself. Now, speaking purely in a personal capacity, not as a representative of the archives or the City London Corporation more generally, I also think it has a lot to answer for, the Gherkin, because as nice as that is, that seemed to be, as I can tell, the start for making buildings in all kinds of weird and wonderful shapes, more for the sake of doing it, so you can do a different shape than something else. But that is purely my personal opinion, and at this point I will stop editorializing in case I get myself in trouble. So that's the reason for including that in the selection today. And then number 73, Lambeth Palace Gate House is included again for a bit of local pride in the Clerkenwell area. So this is very close to us. Today. It houses the part of the museum of the Order of St John. Well worth a visit. I believe they're open today, so you could on your way home, or as another day, combining it with a visit to the London Archives, if that sort of thing is of interest to you. It's also interesting because I believe I'm right in saying that this is the only remaining gate, as in what would have been a gate in the walls around the city of London. Once an important practical and symbolic marker of the boundaries of London. Obviously today still some of the wards, those are the if you like, the boroughs or the constituencies within the City of London are described as within and without the wall. I'm marking back to that. But it was, by this point, it has long since gone. In any kind of coherent form. There are obviously a few sections of it that remain as curiosities. It's been demolished both for practical reasons of traffic and often cannibalised for building material as well. And the other reason I include it is because it gives me a chance to tell a story that I rather like, which is in its earlier incarnation. This was home to a coffee house, that very sort of famous Georgian institution. People, come to drink coffee and converse, and various coffee houses. Various coffee houses would have a various theme, and this one had a fairly famous proprietor. Well, so a famous by association proprietor, I should say. So the previous, the owner of this particular coffee house was William Hogarth's father. I'm sure if you come to a talk like this, you're probably aware who William Hogarth is, but just to say, very famous, arguably the most famous printmaker, illustrator printmaker of the 18th century, and often in his works we see sort of themes of poverty aside riches, of people kind of falling from grace, the difficulty, the hardness of life and making a living are frequently represented. And sort of biographers of Hogarth like to say that this could be in part because his early child experiences of his father's failed business ventures. Coffee houses had to have a theme. You had, we might even say a gimmick. Some would be about literature, some would be about politics, some would be about art, some would be about business. Hogarth's father's coffee house had a classical theme. That's a good start for a coffee house at this time, but he probably took it a little bit too far. You were required to converse in Greek and Latin in this coffee house, and perhaps unsurprisingly, with a small customer base, it was never very successful. Hence the kind of the theme of penury we often see in Hogarth's work. I think I might actually. We might. Oh, I've done that thing where I'm worried I'm not going to have enough to say, and then I've talked far too much. So I think I will skip that last year, and we'll mention these ones. So this is old houses in 4 Street. But I'm particularly interested in number 89. Partly because we don't really see this style of housing very much at all. It's not survived, but it also gives us a sense that it wasn't just. If we're being cynical, it wasn't just sort of Victorian planners that had it in for the so-called relics of old London. There are other factors at play as well. So this is 4 Street, so it's near the location of today's Barbican Centre, and this area was ravaged during the Blitz, very heavily bombed. Huge fires and other devastation there as well. So just really to give the indication. That it wasn't just, it's not just things that were being lost at the time. There's that longer view of things being destroyed across history as well. And there we go. Yeah, I think I finished and put St John's Gate in twice, and just that this can be our last slide, because I also wanted just to show you five subjects as well. The last image in the series, and just to show as well another side of this collection as well. So across the 120 images, we see houses, churches, businesses in terms of the inns. Some interior shots, some halls as well, but even a few little architectural details on the screen there as well. And at that point, we will draw the sort of the presentation to a close. And I'd be very keen if you have questions, comments, dare I even say corrections. They're all welcome. What we'll do is we'll start with the with people in the room here today, because there's a bit of a lag with the broadcast. If you have questions in the room, I'll do that. This device in front of me should pick them up, but I will just repeat them as well, just for the sake of the people at home. So over to you. Yes.
Do we know what the criteria were that Marx used to select his subjects, and particularly how did he prioritise which to cover in which year?
Great, thank you. So the question was, do we know the criteria that Marx used to select his subjects? And in particular, do we know what he chose in which year? I'm not quite sure about the answer to the second bit, but in terms of choosing subjects more generally, and you can actually find it online. You can find quite easily. I think Yale Centre for British Art has a digitized copy of the prints that I alluded to at the beginning. But the summary of that is he wanted to. The purpose wasn't to be encyclopedic. It was to cover what he thought would be a fair representation of things. So I think that's probably a certain amount of understanding London as a whole, and probably being sort of followed really by his heart, what he liked and what he thought was interesting. And that's obviously a bit of a contrast to say something that's not a photographic record, something like the Survey of London, which really was trying to be encyclopedic. But there are some really nice sort of turns of phrase that he talks about. I might even have one here. No, I didn't make a note of it, but basically he's trying to have capture a flavour, sort of the spirit of things, rather than be sort of this is going this year, this is going that year. Yeah, thank you. There's a question here.
How widely circulated were these images, and did they have any impact on a kind of early impulse to conserve the pictures that he, the works that were photographed?
Thank you. So the question was, how widely circulated were these images, and did they have impact in terms of conservation? So widely circulated, they would have been collector's items. As I say, we know there's about 100 of them produced, something like that, and collecting photographs was a popular thing to do. In sort of certain sections of society, to sort of show your taste and your wealth and that sort of thing more generally, and then photography became more popular in a general sense in the Victorian period as a way, actually in very, very similar ways we enjoy it today. Photographs of yourselves, photographs of your family, and so on and so forth. So they would have been, I think they would have been known about, but known about in particular circles, if you see what I mean, as collector's items. And the second point is harder to disentangle. I'm not aware, but again, I sort of have to sort of admit the limits of my expertise. I'm very much a generalist across our collections, but my understanding is that for example, I'm not aware of any of these photographs being used in, say, a particular campaign. As we saw, many of the buildings were lost, and the ones that survived would probably have survived anyway, if you see what I mean, because of their stature. But what I think it is probably really important to stress, which I think hints at the context of your question, this wasn't the only example of this kind of work that's happening. There is a more general sense of things are disappearing, we need to preserve them. It's not just and it's also not just the buildings that are changing, but way of life is changing. That more existential question. So the National Trust is founded, I want to say 1895, but this sort of time period. 1880 is the founding of the London Topographical Society. So there's something more wider in the zeitgeist, certainly at this time. Yeah. Yes, we'll take some questions from home or wherever you happen to be watching. Yeah.
So, practical questions. So Joan Stone asks, in the last photo shown, which way we're looking at St. John's Gate, what do we see through the arch? Is that a carriage?
Okay, so the question is, just to make sure everyone knows, what can we see through the arch? I think that's a carriage. Yes, I think that's some kind of carriage, and there's a particular word for it that I can't picture. I want to say it's a dray, which is a small one horse-drawn carriage. I want to say it's that, but you're right. It is quite hard to make out. But yes, I think it's a horse-drawn carriage. Yeah. Thank you for the question. Any more questions from home at this point, Simon? Okay. Any more questions from the room? Yes.
Do we have any sort of idea of what equipment the photographers use? I would assume glass plates, for example, but size and that sort of.
Yeah. So the question was, do we have an idea of what kind of equipment was used? Yes. This is one of the things you've got me. I wanted to do a little bit more research onto this, and time escaped me. So yes, glass plate would have been the medium used to record the image initially. In terms of equipment, I think we can picture a tripod about the size of the one we have in the room. So that would be, people at home, that's a tripod that would come up to about sort of chest height on a fully grown man such as myself, and you can imagine a wooden box. You see various, and this I don't know, but what it will, and I will look at more. Certainly, if you guys come back in January, I'll have a full answer. But what you will be imagining here is a wooden box. By this point, you are, I believe, but I might be wrong, you're starting to see two lenses. So one lens as a viewfinder, another to capture the image. And what you're starting to see at this point as well, although I'm not sure, is what sometimes called a bellows camera. So you could imagine, like a bellows you would use to play an accordion or feed your fire, that you have the wooden box you might think of as quite typical equipment from this time, and by means of a bellows you can bring the lens forward or back, and obviously by doing that allows you to change the focus in the way that today you would do, with turning the lens or moving backwards and forwards or adjusting with your fingers. So that's that. I would like to do more research. Just bizarrely, the literature that you see doesn't record as much of it as you would like, but I would like to find out more, because it's an very interesting topic. So I'll give you a partial answer to that one if that's okay, but I'd rather give you a partial answer than mislead you. Yeah. Other questions from the room? Yes.
Same person who asks, which way are you facing? Are you facing Clerkenwell City, or where are we looking towards?
So the question is, which way are we facing, Clerkenwell or City?
Facing north.
I think that's facing north as well. Yes, I think. Well, I'm going to, in the best Who Wants to Be a Millionaire style, I'm going to ask the audience. What does the audience think? North. Yeah, north it is. North it is. We'll go with north. Thank you very much. That's what I was going to say. I promise. Yeah, very good. Very good. Any more questions from home? I should take one in the room. You can have as many as you like.
Given what we saw over the weekend, the difference colour makes in our perceptions of buildings with the relaunching of Notre Dame, is there any way of reliably colorising?
That's a big question. So the question was, is there any way of reliably colorising these pictures? That's when I probably admit to the limits of my expertise, but my understanding is that in the world of sort of photography connoisseurs, particularly people who enjoy black and white, the answer is probably no. That you are making a choice if you colorise a photograph, and if you're most concerned with accuracy, then it can't be done sort of reliably in that sense. But I should stress, I think people are entitled to enjoy history and images in whatever way that they want. So if that's something that they find, pleasing or kind of arresting, then that's a nice thing to do. There's all different ways to enjoy art. But if we're concerned with making it more lifelike, improving it as that narrow definition as a form of evidence, then at this stage probably not, because too many decisions need to be made by the person or likely by whatever AI algorithm is being used to make that decision. But it is a really interesting question, because you see that question of colour so often in both images, and I must confess I've not been following the Notre Dame very closely, but it makes me think of, if you're familiar with the Parthenon in Athens, today we think of it as this sort of lovely sort of white sandstone. I believe it was sort of red and blue originally. I forget exactly the colours, but a very different experience because of the changes in colour. Thank you. Other questions from the room? Any questions from home? Jolly good. Well, let me thank you again for coming along. It's always a fun presentation to do. A really nice collection of material. You've been a very warm, friendly audience in person, and the same at home as well. So let me wish you a Merry Christmas and Happy New Year one more time, and hope to see you all in the new year. Thank you again.